Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. Today is the ninth day of January 2021, and I am going to talk to you about a couple people that most people don't even know about. That is Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemollor, who were who were the driving force to eliminate or get rid of Adolf Hitler during the 1940s, especially in the 44, in 1943 and 44. And the reason why I talk about this is because many people don't understand the what actually took place after World War One and how this was all set up and creating World War Two. And what transpired was simply is that in World War One, the Germans, it seemed as though they were going to win the war, especially the last part of it. And what transpired was simply is that the media they plotted to destroy Germany within, and the Kaiser had to eventually to abdicate and resign, and the Germans eventually had to surrender. We talked about this in my class in college about the German humiliating defeat that took place after World War One. That actually created the issue of World War Two, and how it put gas on the fire. With the defeat of the Germans in World War One, the treaty that was supposedly a peace treaty turned out to be nothing but a bondage upon the Germans that the French and the British successfully run Germany to the ground. And that was that many times that the Germans would have to pay reparations to the French and British because of the war. Now remember, at one time in this war, there was two fronts. There was a front on on the Western Front, which was the British, the French, and eventually the Americans later on, 1917. And the Eastern Front was to deal with the Russians. And with the Bolshevik Revolution that took place in Russia, allowed that front to dissipate. In other words, the Germans now, the army no longer had to fight on both sides, Eastern and Western Front. It no longer had to fight on the Eastern Front. And so what took place was that the Germans actually were winning the war, especially the last part of it. And the media had an enormous impact upon the people and the leadership of the country. And eventually what took place was that they were defeated, not by the army in front of them, but the people that backstabbed them. And Hitler would talk about this in his memoirs. Most are not aware that, as I talked about earlier, about the communist takeover of Russia was all planned by the bankers and the industrialists here in America. And I'm sure the British were involved too, but Americans were the ones who were tremendously involved in the revolution to take place in Russia, the Marxist revolution. Now remember, let's go back. The revolutions that took place in 1848 in Europe which was hopeful for the communists or the Bolsheviks to come to power, had failed. In fact, it failed in every country they tried to revolt again. And many of them were put in prison, and others were put in Switzerland. And eventually, those revolutionaries were allowed to come to America. Most people don't know that. See, this is how it all ties in with history, is that eventually these Marxists, most of them were Germans at that time, came to America in 1848 after the revolutions had failed. And so in 49 and 50, they were, Switzerland didn't want them, so they came here to America to, supposedly they're thinking they were going to help out, but in reality, they were just as much revolutionaries here, but we haven't been told the whole truth here. And so what happened simply is the Lincoln campaign was tremendously impacted by the Germans who had actually campaigned for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. And this eventually would break up the whole country here in America. That is, the South would secede, and there would be two different groups of people fighting against each other. Again, nothing happens by accident. Never does. It's all planned out. This wasn't an accident. There were those who were wanting to see the U.S. to break up, because now the United States was becoming a threat economically, especially against Britain and also to the French. And so this is what transpired. So let's fast forward back again to what took place after the war, with Germany losing the war with French and the British and the Americans. You would have thought the Germans would have won, and rightfully they should have. But again, like I said, they were stabbed in the back by the media and the industrialists and the leadership of Germany. So there's a hatred that develops after the war and all the peace treaties and such and such. And I have a particular video that's simply called, let me show you this right quick. This is a video that talks about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a Christian, and he is part of the Confessing Church of Germany. The name of the video is called Hanged on the Twisted Cross, the life and convictions of martyrdom of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And it explains his background, explains his family, explains what leads to eventually the Dietrich decides to eventually, he says, we've got to be the spoke in the wheel here, and we've got to get rid of Hitler. And this is the failed attempt that actually took place at the Wolf Lair in the 1944, because basically the Germans are now, they're on the defensive, especially on the Eastern Front with the Russians, and also with the American and British and French on the Western Front. But Hitler is not going to concede, and things are getting worse in the country as this progresses. As this movie shares, and some of the information I get is from that, also something else I get information from is some of the memoirs of Dietrich Bonhoeffer also. So as I explain this to you, I want to make sure you're aware that simply is that few people know about this. There's two major groups that are actually church groups in Germany at this time. The Lutheran Church is by far the majority in the country. The next group is the Catholics, and the smaller groups are basically either some Anabaptists, some Baptists, and Anabaptists has nothing to do with Baptists. That has nothing to do with that. Anabaptisting simply meant that they were anti-infant baptism, and they also did not believe that any Christian should actually serve in the government or be a part of it, actually not even to run for office as a Christian. That was their so they were what we would call separatists. And so what took place with the pressure eventually taking place of the Catholics capitulated easily. And you'll see in some parts of this movie that actually the swastika is with the cross on the altar of not only the Catholic Church, but also the Lutheran Church. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a theologian. He's a pastor, and he sees he comes even to America and is here when the Depression is taking place here in America. And it's nowhere near as bad here at that point. When he was here in New York City, he actually went to Union Theological Seminary in New York City, as well as I recollect. And he basically has a conversion there with a black minister, a preacher, that is actually a black colleague that was actually at this seminary and became what we call born again. And this changes Dietrich's particular perspective on many things. And he's a writer, and he wrote a few books. He spoke about simply as that the church itself was the community of Christ itself. It wasn't a theological deal, but it was actually a practice, supposedly in the churches. So what changed? Why that? And then I'll explain a little bit about Martin Niemollor. Martin Niemollor is a Lutheran pastor, and he is known for what I would call his well-known quote. And that quote is to do with what he felt was important. And his quote simply means this. And let me share that also with you. This is Martin Niemollor. His quote simply is, "First they came for the Jews, but I did nothing because I'm not a Jew. Then they came for the socialists, but I did nothing because I'm not a socialist. Then they came for the Catholics, but I did nothing because I'm not a Catholic. Finally, they came for me, but by then there was no one left to help me." And what he's talking about here is these guys are important because, you got to speak up against wrong. You got to have conviction. You have to have principles in your life to stand up against those who are what I call simply to destroy the country. And the sad part simply is that in some ways, we live in that same period. A lot has to do with, in other areas, to do with children and how they are treated today, and how the poor are pushed away in some ways as though they're just numbers in our country. And it's just kind of how the situation here in America also economically is similar to, we're headed to what we would call a major problems here in America economically, big time. And so it takes guts to basically to stand against this and speak out. And So what transpires simply is that these two men eventually, and others within the army, they know the writing's on the wall. And what they're wanting to do is prevent total destruction of Germany. They know that the Russians are coming, and they know that the British and Americans are coming, and that their country is going to be destroyed. And so they want to get Hitler out of power, and they want to eliminate him so that others can come in and say, look, we need to sue for peace here before this whole thing comes within our own country. Now, remember, the Germans were on the steps, almost it seemed as though they were on the steps of actually Moscow. They were also in the city of Leningrad. I'm sorry, not Leningrad, Stalingrad, I'm sorry. When the army was basically diverted by Hitler, that he did not seek the oil-rich fields of the oil and chose to attack the city simply because of the leader name on the city to be something that he could hold and praise himself. When reality simply is it was out of the way, not out of the way, but it simply should have been basically a defensive measure instead of an offensive measure. They should have sought the oil fields, as well as I recollect, in the Baku area of the Soviet Union. And the sad part simply is many German soldiers eventually were killed, and eventually many of them were taken to the gulags, and most of them died also. And Hitler would not allow his particular general to sue for peace or ask for surrender until basically the general gave up, because he basically knew that they were going to be all killed. And this means that simply is once that's broken, the Germans never really they go back on they don't go back on the offensive anymore. They're now on the defensive from now on. So this is the high water mark of what takes place in that period of time. I believe that the Germans were probably no more than 10 miles away from Moscow. They had already were in Stalingrad, and they were actually fighting there. And they were actually near St. Petersburg, which I think was considered at that time, changed its name to Leningrad. It's gone back to St. Petersburg now in Russia, Soviet Union. And what took place simply was these men knew that simply is we've got to do something. So the Confessing Church is a small group of people. They have a small seminary in a small area in Germany, in Fenwalk. Sorry, get the pronunciation right. And there are students, probably no more than 25 students at the seminary. And actually, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a professor there teaching at that point. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the things I need to explain to you is came from a non-church background. His family had been involved in being goldsmiths, lawyers, and actually were priests in the Lutheran Church. But at his time period, there were mainly lawyers in his family. And also his father was a psychologist. So at the age of 14 years old, Dietrich decided that he wanted to be a theologian and chose that, and to the dismay of his parents. Now remember, he's not a Christian. He's not in the church. He's not a Christian. He is actually what we would call someone that comes from the secular perspective and enters the seminary as going to be a theologian. And I'm not a Christian, okay, but I want to explain to you that this has bears a mark that there people ask, why was it not anyone speaking out at that point? Why was Hitler coming into power? Well, Hitler took advantage of all the things that took place during the Depression in Germany. The situation with basically the money became worthless. People had to the paper money became to the point you had a this is serious now, folks. They would have a wheelbarrow of money, paper money, in order to buy a loaf of bread. I'm not joking you. In fact, it got so bad, the inflation got so bad in Germany that actually those that work 8 hours a day were actually given an hour to go once they got paid at midday to go and deposit their check and get bread. And actually, at the end of the day, the same thing occurred also. So inflation was taking place at a rapid pace, a super rapid pace. Yes, there were jobs, but the money was totally worthless. It is in some ways nowhere near as bad as it has been in other countries, and especially in Zimbabwe, which was running 1,000% or 2,000% inflationary rate in its whole issue. This was not that far back, maybe 10 years ago. Another country would be in that same stack would be Argentina, who went through the same episode in the 80s and 90s. And you are starting to see that here in the United States too. Inflation is starting to move, and people are not they're seeing it. It's very clear what's going on. But this time simply is there are people who don't have jobs here in America. There were still people who had jobs in Germany, you know. So Hitler's party took advantage of this. And they what they called themselves the National Socialists. And what we would call another group that simply is the Italians with Mussolini would be the fascist socialists. So let me explain a little bit about that. National Socialism is a whole deal simply is that people still have freedom, but the government is actually itself is socialist. So it's going to look out for people. With the fascist group that was in Italy, it was simply is that the government owned everything. I mean, you own your business, but in reality, you paid the government. That is, you were basically a slave to that. In other words, you gave your money in to the government. Say, for example, you have $100 and you get $100 profit. Well, they would get $100, and then they would give it back to you, maybe $10 of that $100, or maybe $15 out of that. So in reality, it's a completely different perspective. And then we go to the issue with the socialists that are actually in the Soviet Union. They're communists to the extreme. You don't own anything, and we're all communists. You don't own land. You don't own anything. You see, you are given food by the blessings of the government, and you are a slave to the state. So let's go back to what happened. Now, what's taking place here is once the Germans are on the defensive here and are actually moving back towards Germany and no longer a threat. Actually, the one last battle that took place is called the Battle of Kursk, which is the largest tank battle ever to take place between two foes, and that was the Soviet Union and Germany. And with this particular battle was basically what I would call one of the last stands, if not the last stand, for the Germans to hold off the Russians. And they lost. The Germans lost. Germans had a superior tank, far more superior to any other tank out there, except that the Russians had a tank that was more mobile, and it was a Tu-38 tank, and it had more armor on it, and it was faster. So it's far more maneuverable than the Tiger tank or the Panther tank of the Germans. And they had more of them. So we're talking simply is that when they had more of them, they could afford to take losses. The Germans couldn't afford to take losses, you see. So with the Battle of Kursk taking place and the defeat there, it's now the Red Army is the threat. And in fact, we know that as the end of the war, many of those soldiers who fought against the Reds are actually leaving their positions to be on the front with the West, with British, French, and American troops, because they were terrified of what the Red Army would do to them. And rightfully so, because of what they did to the Russian citizens, and also what they did when they actually attacked the Russians when they chose to Operation Barbarossa. So let's go back to these guys here and why this key. Another key figure in this picture is Karl Barth, who's a Swiss theologian. When Dietrich Bonhoeffer's in New York City, Karl Barth sends him a letter and tells him he needs to get his behind back to Germany. He needs to come back to Germany because major things are happening. Also, his family members are telling him if the educated people fall for this whole thing with Hitler, it's over. In other words, the people who have the intellectuals, if they fall for Hitler, already the non-well-to-do, the middle class had already fell for that. And the only thing that had any hope to hold Hitler from gaining power was the intellectuals. And they wanted him to get back to Germany because they were afraid, I think, in some ways, that if he didn't get back to Germany, he may not be able to get into the country later on. So the reason why I like this guy, why I respect him so much, is because he stood in the gap. He's a man's man. And what I mean by that, he's not only has a man of courage and unbelievable ability to stand against onslaught at what they were doing, because he's dealing with a small group here. So this is a natural born leader in a lot of ways. The other thing simply is he cared. And I think that's the key here, folks. There are many leaders that are great in some ways, but many leaders don't have care. They don't listen to their heart, you see. And one of the reasons why Dietrich got in trouble later on, he was trying to get, he got caught. He was trying to get Jewish settlers out of the country. I think there were 7 of them. And he got caught. So he was a man of action. When he spoke of things and what's happening, he did those things. And I knew of him in seminary studies, have books of him, actually have, this is one of his books here. I think I got another book, a couple other books of his here. I respect this man for what he stood for. He stood against the cog, and he stood against the wheel, the system, and stood against it. Said, no, you're not going to do this on my watch. You see, you're going to have, there's going to be a fight here. I'm going to stand against it. This is not right. This is not morally right. I'm not going to be a part of this. And so they worked together. Niemollor was out somewhat involved, but Dietrich Bonhoeffer is really the key. He works with Army intelligence officers, and eventually they are able to get a bomb into a case, and one of the gentlemen who was able to get that in and eventually set it off, and to actually get away from it, but it wasn't successful. Apparently, the table there was such a well-designed table. In other words, it was made of real wood. That is, and it injured Hitler. But what I understand simply is the attaché case was moved, so it was not near Hitler at that time, and so he actually messed up his arm and something of that nature, and had some problems with that. But it did not kill him. And this is at Wolf-Lair. This is where he stayed at in Poland. It's still there today, as well as I recollect. I think it's still there. It's still seen. People can go see it. It's like a tourist thing to go see where the command post was, where Hitler was. And he was actually commanding what was going on the Eastern Front. There's with this happening, they discovered what he was doing also, that is, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that he was trying to save these 7 Jews to get out of the country. And then they discovered what he was doing also to actually have Hitler destroyed, killed. Most of the army officers are the ones who get killed. And at the very end of the war, they move Bonhoeffer from a different prison to closer off away from the enemy lines, closer into Germany, and eventually he's killed. He's hanged himself. What we have simply is that even the prisoners react, and even the executioner made remarks that they've never seen a man so well composed, knowing he was going to die. And so he has a testimony per se. The prisoners were amazed in his attitude and how, which they saw it. They saw how he was composed, not only just simply with his death coming, but simply in how his nature was towards others. And so he had a strong testimony to those around him. And I respect someone who's that way. I have to, no matter what their beliefs are. I have to. I have to respect someone who's got the guts and yet has the care within himself to stand and do what's right when all is lost. That defeat is there. You just, you turn tail and run. And we know this simply is that when the war ended, that the Russians seized almost all of the areas in the east. And the United States allowed this to happen under the Morgenthau plan, was to allow Germany to be split in half, that Berlin would be split in 4 sectors, and that all the countries that were involved in the Eastern fight were allowed to become Soviet satellites or states. We allowed it. The United States allowed it. The British did. And most of the blame should actually be blamed on Dwight Eisenhower, who was actually he was the supreme commander of all Allied troops. That is, with the Allies on the Western Front. He is the one who continued to slow the pace down that actually allow the Russians to actually seize more properties, land from all over the East. It was Dwight Eisenhower. And most people are not aware of who Eisenhower was. That is, Dwight Eisenhower was key in many ways. And what I mean by that? Well, most are not aware, or I hope, basically what I see simply is that Dwight Eisenhower and others were used with the bonus army, who were what I would call, what's the word I want to say? That were wanting their bonus, that is, American soldiers wanting their bonus that they were promised during the First World War. And Dwight Eisenhower, here, I want to tell you another thing in history here before I forget. It is not the Germans who first discovered concentration camps. It is not the Soviet Union who were the first to do with concentration camps. It's the British. Don't you ever forget that, folks. The British were the first to use concentration camps with the Boers in South Africa under Winston Churchill's leadership. You need to know the facts. These death camps were upon those who were in South Africa. Don't ever let anybody tell you that the Germans were the first that dealt with the concentration camps or the Soviet Union. You're both wrong. In the late 1800s, the British were the first to put up concentration camps in South Africa. You need to know that, because simply is that Britain itself is many times involved in things that we are not aware, that the quote unquote the British West East India Company is involved in destroying many things around the world in the past, as they took much of the areas of India and other countries like Burma. Also was involved in China with the whole issue of the drug trade. Most are not aware of that. And I'm sure that they're still involved. We know simply is that in Afghanistan, the United States is involved. And we also know simply is that in Vietnam also that the drug trade was a big deal. It was not always to deal with the communists. Many American soldiers died for drugs. It was not to save other people. Eventually, we lost the war there, you see. So back to the story here, and you just need to understand here that many people said, where was the people who fought against this system? Where were they? Why we don't hear anything about it? Well, most people don't know about it because simply they don't teach you that in school. They don't tell you that. They don't want you to know. Because the Americans are, we do everything right. We care about people. We wouldn't do anything bad, you see. And but that's not true, you see. And I just, I was thinking simply is this, is a Canadian guy who actually was in a Canadian Army official, and his name escapes me. But we actually, you need to know this is another fact, that the Eisenhower death camps took place where these German soldiers who ran away from the Eastern Front sought to come to the Western Front to save themselves. And in reality, they died in these concentration camps. These concentration camps were actually what I would call out in the weather. There were no tents. So when it rained and snowed, these men hovered in the cold weather. There was no latrines, nothing of that nature, nothing to treat people with respect, with honor, even though they were your enemy. They were not fed well, and any soldier who tried to help them was threatened that they were going to lose their positions, a rank, if they said anything about this. And so, guess what? No one knew about it until probably only 10 or 15 years ago, when someone eventually said, we got to talk about this. And so this is the book I want to show you here. Let me go to it here for you to show you, share the screen, because most of you won't believe this, but it is true. This is a book here by Other Losses by James I can't pronounce it. Backel. Eisenhower death camps: the last dirty secret of World War II. This is what I would call some brave people who actually try to tell you the truth, the other losses. This book was actually written in 1991, so that'll give you an idea how long ago it's been. I'm afraid that this particular soldier is probably no longer alive, the author of this book. But I think he was from Canada, as well as I recollect. You're not told the real truth a lot of times, folks. You really aren't. And so we did this to the Germans after World War II. So tell me, what's the difference here? And we're talking about a general here who does this. And we're talking about a man who eventually becomes the president of the United States, you see. And so this is a book called Other Losses. And you need to research the truth. You need to find out the truth here. So I wanted to simply talk about that. Again, like I said, I kind of digress here, but I wanted just to share to you that these people stood against the system and did their best to actually get Hitler out of power. Eventually, we don't even know what ever happened to Hitler. We've been told the stories that he committed suicide. I don't even know if that's even true. I just know simply is that Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemollor were the two major people who actually stood against it. And many German officers that saw that simply as this is not going to turn out good for the Germans. And it didn't. It didn't, you see. Berlin was split in four parts, and eventually it was eventually broken up in two parts, the American sector, because I think the French gradually got out of it, and it was just the American-British sectors, and then it was the Soviet Union sectors, and eventually in the 1961 or 62, the Russians decide to build a wall in Berlin, and the United States sends in what they call the Berlin airlift. We also know simply that Eastern Germany was rule. They were called the Stasi, secret police, just ruthless. So the German people paid a dear price in this war for following Hitler. And it's true that we don't need to follow leaders, because most leaders are not genuine. Most leaders don't have hearts. Most are there to serve themselves. So again, I need to wrap this up. It's about 45 minutes here. So I appreciate you listening, and try to remember that the United States itself has done a lot of harm to other countries too, a ton of it. It needs to stop. No more. We don't need to be involved in any more wars. We need to leave people alone, let them live, and we don't need to have a huge army. We don't need to have over 300 bases around the world, and paying billions and billions of dollars out there that actually is wasted. And also the military defense weapons that we use, such and such. All this is putting money in people's pockets, and it's detrimental to our own country. That is, economically, we could be using that money not only much wiser, instead of actually having all these bases around the world. And most of us were told in my day, oh, well, this is part of the United States protecting all countries for trade. I don't think so. I think it's basically us enforcing our way, basically making sure that our ships get through. You see, it was, or other allies, that is, not just ours, to be able to move those materials from one place to the other. It's economics. So thank you for listening. And if you got any comments, please let me know. And you have a good night.